This is Ed Salzberg, Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum. We convene global experts to address issues impacting society, from climate and other disruptions to natural systems. In this 20-minute session, excerpted from a recent SSF webinar on food security in an urbanizing world, Dr. Alan Kelley, Dean Emeritus of the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine and co-author of Food Security in a Global Economy, Veterinary Medicine and Public Health, discusses the factors underlying food security in cities and contrasts the food security issues prevalent in China, India, and Africa, and how to think about addressing them. The issues for food security are different in each country, but the results are the same. For access to the entire food security video and to the rest of the educational webinars in our archives, I invite you to join the Security and Sustainability Forum. Membership is free, and you get the opportunity to learn from the leading global experts in the field. Go to www.securityandsustainabilityforum.org to register. Now it's time for Alan to discuss food security and cities.
So I'm going to talk about food security in the cities and start off with a quote from The Economist from last year that in the next 40 years, the world has to produce as much food as has been produced in all of the past 500 years. Well, and I've added, while accommodating for climate change and more limited water supplies. That comment about the increase in demand is related to the growth in the world population as we move from 7 billion to 9.2 billion. You put that into everyday terms, it actually means that every week in the next 38 years, there will be 1.1 million more mouths to feed each week for the next 38 years, as I've said. The other point I want to make to introduce this talk is that food security is not just about food production, and I'll illustrate that as I go along. Next slide. So food policy is enormously important. Goals should be threefold. To one, sustainably intensify agriculture. Growth and productivity must exceed population growth if we're going to keep ahead of the population and feed it. We have to improve access to food, and that means infrastructure development, and we have to improve the nutritional quality of diets. The challenges include the fact that the amount of arable land is finite. The world loses 30 million acres of agricultural land per year due to city expansion, contamination, drought, and desertification. And the fact that intensification leads to fewer jobs. It generally means moving people out of agriculture, and we'll come back and illustrate that in more detail. But what that also means is that there will be increased migration to cities, and to accommodate for that migration needs to be the development of an urban manufacturing economy. If that doesn't develop fast enough, and if job growth doesn't develop adequately, then we have growth of slums, and that's one of the problems that's going to face the world in the 21st century. Next slide. So what do I mean by sustainable intensification of agriculture? What it means is increasing animal productivity, not increasing animal numbers. And I say this because many of the developing countries are responding to an increase in demand for animal protein by increasing animal numbers. That's unsustainable. We have to increase the level of productivity. And I use the example of the development of the dairy industry in this country to get at what I want to impart. If you look at this table, you see 1950, the United States, an average yield per cow was 664 gallons. To provide the needs of the nation at that time, we had 22 million cows. You have to have a follow-up herd of 17.6 heifers. And so that means we had a total population of about 40 million animals. And one cow in 1950 at that level of productivity could support the needs of 30 people. And per gallon of milk, there was a release of 0.0485 pounds of methane per gallon. Now look what happened in 2010. There's a fourfold increase in the productivity of milk production per cow, and that's the result of genetics, improved management, and nutrition. As a result of that, then the population of cows, the numbers of cows, declined from 22 million to 9 million. The follow-up herd of heifers dropped to 7.2 million, and the total cattle population then declined to 16.2 million cows. That's the direction we have to go in the future when we feed the world. One cow in 2010, that level of productivity can supply the needs of 121 people. That's using a USDA formula. And because you reduce the numbers of animals but increase productivity, then the level of methane production has dropped substantially to 0.158 pounds of methane per gallon of milk. China is about the situation the United States was in 1950. China is making significant efforts to improve its productivity, but in fact it has to overcome the problems of melamine that have bedeviled the milk industry repeatedly for the last several years. Look finally, however, at India. Incredibly low level of production. India has the largest dairy herd in the world, largest number of cattle in the world, 304 million. Average cow in India produces 300 gallons a year. That's 102 million cows in milk. And methane emission per gallon of milk exceeds 0.1 pounds of milk, 1 pound of methane per gallon of milk. The question is that sustainable? Next slide. So urbanization also changes agriculture from subsistence-led systems to an integrated market-driven system. Agriculture must supply distant cities using a robust food supply infrastructure. And you have to recognize that cities of 10 million people or more have a food supply generally that will last 3 to 4 days. The food supply system has to be robust to sustain these people, and that means many things. But it includes the fact that agricultural productivity is more and more going to depend, at least arable land productivity is going to depend more and more upon irrigation. And this comes at a time when we've reduced availability of water. Urbanization also changes demand with increased affluence and demand for an improved diet. And this is universally true no matter what culture you're looking at. People want to improve their diet as their wherewithal improves. There is also, in the cities in particular, consumption of processed foods with high energy but lower nutritional value. And that is one of the problems that faces the world. There's obesity, it leads to obesity, and obesity is largely, in the developing world, an urban disease. Next slide. To show you how the world is changing in terms of food production, food demand, the table shows you the changes in total meat and milk production in millions of tons in the developed world comparing 1980 to 2030. If you look at the developing world meat production, it's an increase of 560% in the 50 years that is shown here. That's a huge increase. Most of that production will be for pork and poultry. There's also an enormous increase in milk production. People in the developing world have discovered in many instances the value of milk, so it is also increasing very rapidly. Compared to the developed world, there are much more modest increases in demand for animal proteins. So this is what's known as the livestock revolution, huge increases in animal numbers, but that also comes with substantial increase in risk of infectious diseases that can be transmitted from animals to humans, and also increasing problems of foodborne diseases. Next slide. So now let's look at 3 regions, China, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and to start with China. And the challenges, they're all different in the different regions. China, it has 20% of the world's population, 36% are poor and rural small farmers. China is faced with the problem that it has only 7% of the world's arable land, 7% of the world's water resources, and average farm size is about 1/3 of an acre. The problem of 1/3 of an acre is that small farms like that limit investment and advances in technology and productivity. So to increase farm size, people have to be moved off the land, and in fact China has been doing that very successfully for a number of years now. And it has to create an urban manufacturing economy. So people have been moved off farms, have been moved into apartment blocks for the first time in their lives. They have plumbing and water facilities. And China, as I say, has been successful in developing its manufacturing economy. As a result, though there are slums in China, they're not a major problem as they were 50 years ago. Next slide. Now, the way that China has going about feeding its people with limited land resources, and in many ways it doesn't have much option, is industrialized swine and poultry industries. Large production systems, such as I've shown in the picture below, account for 80% of the increases in pork, and it should say pork and poultry production in the last decade, that comes from these systems. These systems commonly come with some problems, however. They're commonly peri-urban in location, and that has the major issue that they are supported. Because China has such limited land resources, it imports vast quantities of soybean and corn to feed these animals. That means there's a huge concentration of nutrients into the peri-urban areas, but there's nowhere to spread that manure onto land. It's too limited. And so all too frequently the effluent gets washed into rivers and streams and creates environmental health problems. But it also, as I have indicated, there are huge human health infectious disease problems. These facilities are peri-urban, they're close to city population centers. And when you have concentrated animal populations like that, infectious diseases can go through them, such as salmonellosis, for example, can go through these facilities with great speed and can easily be transmitted to adjacent human populations. Now, China is also undergoing a supermarket revolution. There's a massive influx of foreign direct investment. That accounts for over 60% of food sales in China now. And it's geared towards an urban middle class, a class that wants to go shopping once a week, probably has refrigeration so they can maintain their supplies adequately. And food at supermarket is less expensive, it's safer and uniform in quality. Now, supermarkets, as indicated, are also typically linked to supply chains involving large producers. So the industrialization of the food system and the supermarket revolution really go hand in hand. It's a direction that China is obviously going to continue to go in. Now, one of the other problems, next slide, is that these large units marginalize small farmers and undermine social structures. In hilly regions of China, for example, ancient terracing provides a very efficient system of farming, and this needs to be maintained and to persist. Farmers in these regions need to be integrated into an urban food supply system. That probably means forming cooperatives to allow them access to the urban food supply system. Next slide. So let me change then to India, and I finish with talking about the need to form cooperatives. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that India is the largest milk producer in the world, and it has Amul, India's largest milk cooperative, that has been extraordinarily successful. I think one of the lessons that comes from forming these cooperatives is that they came from the ground up. This came from small producers actually rebelling against the way in which middlemen were treating and giving them prices from milk. And it's a very successful democratic process. To come back to India as a whole, you'll see that India has millions of small farmers with low productivity, and I've already indicated that in the milk producing industry. Average farm size in India is 3.5 acres. That's 10 times the size of farms in China. Right? The goal of the Indian government is to expand production of small farmers, develop a rural economy, and maintain social systems. Next slide. Because of its capacity to produce food, India should be self-sufficient in the production of food staples. Growth in domestic food grain production, has increased faster than the population growth for the last 50 years. There should be no food insecurity in India. However, because there's chronic hunger and malnutrition on a massive scale persists in India. 50% of the children are underweight and malnourished. 21% of the adults are malnourished. There's huge malnourishment in India. Next slide. The main reason is some inefficiencies of production, but the greatest problem is that 40% of the food is wasted. India has a very poor distribution system, and that's due to fragmentation of the distribution system in inadequate storage space. There are multiple middlemen. There's a high markup on foods between the farmer and the consumer. Foods are sold at millions of small Kirana stores. And there's at present limited supermarket penetration. Excellent. There are numerous government initiatives to address the problem, some of which have been somewhat successful. Food for poor, unbalanced, the food for the poor and government programs, however, is unfortunately unbalanced. It's focused on cereals and is lacking in micronutrients. So in 2011, the government voted to permit foreign direct investment in supermarkets and to give access to Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, some of the world's largest supermarket chains. They need their investment, but also they need the technical know-how for developing supermarkets. The intent then is to cut out middlemen, provide fresher produce for people in the cities, reduce spoilage, and reduce price markups. But that bill had been met with massive opposition because it cuts out the middlemen, and there's talk of loss of something like 8 million jobs if this comes to pass. So at present, this food direct investment bill has been tabled. It's one of the challenges that India has to face. So the challenges in India are very different to those in China. So finally, let's go to Africa. Africa is the world's most food insecure continent. 70% of rural and 43% of urban population is food insecure. By 2020, food insecure population in sub-Saharan Africa is projected to exceed 500 million, half a billion people. And that's in large measure due to failure of the agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa. 80% of the soils are degraded. There is no fertilizer plant in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and farmers have to pay 4 to 6 times the price that a farmer in this country would pay for fertilizer. As a result, migration to cities is rapid, but because of the slow growth of manufacturing economy, there's rapid growth of slum populations. Slum populations in sub-Saharan Africa are increasing at a rapid rate, the most rapid rate in the world. And in fact, the estimates are that by 2020, 70% of the African population, the sub-Saharan African population, will live in slums. That means also that there's significant importation of food, and so urban populations are vulnerable to high levels of food imports and price fluctuations. It is also estimated that 65% of the future increase in hunger related to climate change will be in sub-Saharan African countries, particularly in the Horn of Africa. So there's a great concern about the future directions for Africa and its food insecurity. Excellent. So African agriculture has to produce more food. Presently, international aid is focused on increasing the productivity of small farmers and to develop a rural economy. And the question, however, is that going to be sufficient to be able to provision burgeoning cities of more than 10 million people? But in addition, competition is growing as the numbers of supermarkets in sub-Saharan Africa is increasing. And they are ideally increasing with consolidated farms, which are going into large-scale operations. So there's a need to increase off-farm employment and infrastructure, and there's a need for infrastructure to reduce waste and supply cities with fresh, perishable foods. These are huge challenges that Africa and the developed world has to work with. And final slide. So I'll finish just with a quote from the World Bank in 1990, that urban poverty will become the most significant and politically explosive problem in the 21st century.